On the afternoon of Saturday the 16th of June 1883, Richard and Margaret Mills watched 4 of their children set off for Victoria Hall. Like hundreds of other children across Sunderland, they each carried a penny in their pocket and a ticket for an afternoon of magic. A few hours later, Richard and Margaret expected to hear the front door burst open, followed by 4 excited voices, all trying to tell the same story at once. Every parent knows that moment. You watch your children disappear down the street with their brothers and sisters, waving goodbye as they hurry off to meet their friends. You remind them to enjoy themselves, perhaps tell them to behave, and then you get on with your afternoon, never imagining that anything could possibly go wrong. Then the church bells begin to ring, not in celebration, but in alarm. Across Sunderland, anxious parents pour into the streets and make their way towards Victoria Hall, searching desperately for their children. Some will find them, many will not. By the end of that June afternoon, 183 children had lost their lives. The cause was something so ordinary that almost nobody would have believed it possible. A door. Just a door. Today it is a disaster that many people outside of Sunderland have forgotten. Yet every time you push open the crash bar on an emergency exit, in a cinema, theatre or shopping centre, you are benefiting from lessons written in unimaginable grief. Sunderland in 1883 was a town built on industry. Along the banks of the River Wear, shipyards stretched for miles. Coal poured through its busy docks, and the furnaces of its glassworks glowed long after darkness had fallen. It was a place where hard work shaped everyday life, and for many families, a 6-day working week was simply accepted as part of making ends meet. Money was rarely plentiful, which made life's small pleasures all the more precious. A penny was never just a penny. It was often earned by running errands, helping around the house, or carrying out little jobs for neighbours. Sometimes it was a coin quietly set aside by parents who had very little to spare, but still wanted their children to enjoy a rare afternoon of entertainment. For many of Sunderland's boys and girls, a visit to Victoria Hall wasn't simply another day out. It was something they had been looking forward to ever since a travelling magician named Alexander Fay toured the town's schools promoting his forthcoming performance. Admission tickets were left with the headmaster, and before lessons ended, teachers handed them out to their pupils. By the time the youngsters reached home that afternoon, many were already pleading with their parents for a penny. Before long, children across Sunderland were talking about little else. Victoria Hall stood opposite Mowbray Park, and although it had opened only 11 years earlier, it had already become one of Sunderland's most impressive public buildings. Concerts, lectures, political meetings and travelling entertainments all found a home beneath its roof, and on Saturday afternoons it often echoed with the laughter of children. On this particular afternoon, the stars of the show were Alexander Fay and his sister Annie, entertainers from Tynemouth Aquarium. Their programme promised conjuring tricks, comic sketches, ventriloquism, and their much-advertised Great Ghost Illusion, exactly the sort of spectacle guaranteed to capture young imaginations. Before leaving home, 10-year-old Barbara Blakey had one last request for her father. "Be sure to get me a nice flower to wear on Sunday when I say my piece at the anniversary." He promised he would. Long before the performance began, Victoria Hall was alive with excitement. Boys in flat caps and girls with ribbons in their hair filled the seats, their voices bouncing from the walls as they pointed towards the stage and wondered how the tricks would be done. For many, it was the first magic show they had ever seen. And it didn't disappoint. Alexander Fay held the children spellbound. His tricks were greeted with gasps and applause, while Annie's performances kept the audience laughing. At one point, clouds of theatrical smoke drifted across the stage, causing a few youngsters to feel unwell, before the pair won them back with the appearance of live pigeons that fluttered above the audience's heads. The performance had been everything the children had hoped for. Alexander Fay's magic tricks had filled the hall with laughter and applause, and as the show came to an end, there was one last surprise. Children holding certain numbered tickets would receive prizes. While those lucky youngsters began making their way forward, Alexander and his assistants kept the excitement alive by tossing sweets into the audience below. Small hands reached into the air and cheers filled the hall. From the gallery it was difficult to hear every word of the announcement. What the children could see were the sweets flying through the air and presents already being handed out. Whether they believed every child would receive a prize, thought they might miss out on the sweets, or simply followed the crowd, nobody can say for certain. What we do know is that within moments, more than 1,000 children began leaving the gallery to go downstairs to the stage. One of the children was Georgina, who had attended the show with her friend Margaret Dodds. Georgina walked with crutches, and before the entertainment had even finished, the two girls left their seats and made their way towards the staircase. At the inquest, Georgina described seeing a man standing beside the exit carrying a box of prizes. "This way for prizes," he called. She said the door had been standing fully open against the wall. Then she watched as the man pulled it away from the wall. He asked whether children could still get through. "Yes," Georgina replied, "but only one at a time." Within moments, more children arrived from the gallery. Georgina could no longer reach the doorway. Unable to move quickly because of her crutches, she backed into the corner behind the door and used them as a barrier to protect herself. From there she watched children collapse around her feet. She believed some were already dead. Eventually rescuers pulled her free. Outside the hall she was found by her aunt, who took her home. The staircase was 7 feet wide and descended in 3 flights, broken by small landings. It had carried thousands of people safely since Victoria Hall first opened its doors. There was nothing about it to suggest that within the next few minutes it would become the scene of one of Britain's worst disasters involving children. At the foot of the final flight stood a sturdy wooden door. It opened inwards, and, like countless doors in public buildings of the time, it had been secured with a bolt that allowed it to open only part of the way. The opening measured just 22 inches, enough for children to pass through one at a time while attendants checked their tickets as they left. On an ordinary afternoon it was an entirely unremarkable arrangement, but this was no ordinary afternoon. The first children reached the doorway and began filtering through exactly as intended. Behind them came more children from the gallery, and then more. Within seconds the steady flow became a crowd. Those at the front had no room to move any faster. Those behind couldn't see why the line had slowed, and still they kept coming. Then the flow slowed. Those nearest the front found themselves pressed together, waiting for the line to move. More children continued arriving from the staircase behind them. Within seconds, the landing was full. The youngsters at the back had no way of seeing what had happened. All they knew was that the crowd had stopped moving. They continued to shuffle forward, carried by the weight of more than 1,000 children still leaving the gallery. Children were piled upon one another, some 7 or 8 feet deep. Many of the children were no longer screaming. They simply didn't have enough breath left. The hall's caretaker, Frederick, fought desperately to free the door from the stage side, but the bolt could not be reached. The very children trapped against it prevented it from opening any further. Realizing that every second mattered, Graham abandoned the attempt. He raced to another staircase, threw open the dress circle exit, and diverted around 600 children away from the crush before returning to help with the rescue. For the children on the staircase, the pressure built with astonishing speed. Children stumbled, Others lost their footing and disappeared beneath the feet of those still being carried forwards. Those at the front were forced hard against the partly open door until there was simply nowhere left to go. Many would die where they stood, not from broken bones or terrible wounds, but because the crushing weight around them left their lungs unable to expand. Their cries became weaker and weaker, until, for many, they stopped altogether. Not every child continued towards the staircase. Some, realizing something was terribly wrong ahead, turned back, pulling younger children with them. They escaped through the dress circle exit that Frederick Graham had wisely left standing open before the performance began. Soon more rescuers arrived. Dr. James Waterston, Dr. Walker Beatty, and Dr. George Bolton forced their way through the gathering crowds. Captain Robert Thompson, formerly of the steamship Nebo, and Frederick Bonner, coachman to Dr. Potts, threw themselves into the rescue without hesitation. The only way to reach many of the children still showing signs of life was for rescuers to join hands, stretching themselves across the pile of bodies until one could reach a tiny hand or arm still moving beneath the weight of the crush. As Dr. Waterston struggled to rescue other people's children, he believed his own might already be lying somewhere beneath the crush. Still, he never stopped. Back over by the stage where the performance had just ended, those handing out sweets and prizes had no idea that, only a few yards away, a nightmare was already unfolding. A young woman, on hearing the commotion, ran to the nearby home of Dr. Thomas Lambert. She told him only that a little boy had collapsed inside Victoria Hall. Expecting to treat a single patient, Lambert hurried across the road. Instead, as he reached the staircase, he later wrote that he found himself looking into what he described as a dark, horrible pit of destruction. As rescuers fought to reach those trapped, many of the children further back could only watch in bewilderment. One of them was William Codling. Sitting near the front of the gallery meant he was now at the back of the crowd when everyone tried to leave. It was a small twist of fate that almost certainly saved his life. William could do nothing but watch as the terrible scene unfolded before him. Years later he remembered standing spellbound as body after body was carried from the hall and laid in rows upon the pavement. As heartbreaking as the scene was, there were moments of hope. Dr. Lambert later recalled how children who appeared close to death often revived once they were carried out into the fresh air. A drink of cold water, a few precious breaths, and some were soon able to walk away. Word spread through Sunderland. Then the church bells began to ring, not to celebrate, but to summon help and warn that something terrible had happened at Victoria Hall. Within minutes, parents abandoned whatever they were doing and hurried towards the hall. Mothers called their children's names as they ran. Fathers pushed through the growing crowds, desperate for news. Neighbours tried to comfort one another, while fearing the worst for their own families. Outside Victoria Hall, confusion quickly turned to heartbreak. No one knew exactly who had survived. Some children wandered the streets in shock, physically unharmed but unable to comprehend what they had witnessed. Others searched desperately for brothers, sisters and friends who never emerged from the building. The search was made even harder because there was no single place where the victims had been taken. Some of the injured were carried to the infirmary, others to the nearby Palatine Hotel, while many of the children who had died were identified by their parents and taken home. Families hurried from one place to another, clinging to the hope that the child they couldn't find had simply been taken somewhere else. For many parents, the hardest journey was walking slowly along the rows of children, searching for a familiar face. Among those who never came home were the 4 children of Richard and Margaret Mills. They would not be the only family devastated that afternoon. In all, 183 children lost their lives at Victoria Hall, including an entire class from a local Sunday school. The youngest victim was just 3 years old. The days that followed were unlike anything Sunderland had ever known. Black crape hung from front doors and shop windows. Schools closed their doors, businesses fell silent, and work across the town gave way to mourning. Thousands of people lined the streets as one funeral procession followed another, the sound of horses' hooves and church bells replacing the bustle of everyday life. For Richard and Margaret Mills there was no single coffin to follow. They buried 4 children in 2 neighbouring graves at Bishop Wearmouth Cemetery. They were far from alone. Across Sunderland, 25 sets of brothers and sisters had been lost, leaving streets where neighbours no longer heard the familiar sounds of children playing together. The tragedy reached far beyond Wearside. Queen Victoria sent a message of sympathy to the people of Sunderland and contributed to the relief fund. Donations arrived from across Britain to help bereaved families and pay for the children's funerals. Among those who never returned home was Barbara Blakey. Her father had kept his promise and bought the flower she had asked for. Instead of wearing it proudly at the church the following day, it was laid upon her coffin. The disaster touched something deep within the Victorian public. Almost every parent could picture their own son or daughter setting off with a penny in their pocket, expecting nothing more than an afternoon of laughter and wonder. The tragedy did not end with the children. William Robertson was one of the local men who rushed inside to help the rescuers. Historical accounts say he worked alongside others, carrying the bodies of children from the hall. Friends later recalled that the sights he witnessed changed him completely. The cheerful man they had known never seemed to return. Just 3 days after the disaster, William became gravely ill. After little more than 30 hours, he died. Contemporary reports attributed his death to the overwhelming shock of what he had experienced that afternoon. In the days that followed, Sunderland searched for answers as well as loved ones. An inquest was opened to determine how an ordinary afternoon of children's entertainment had ended in one of Britain's worst tragedies. Witness after witness described the desperate scenes on the staircase. Rescuers spoke of struggling to reach the children trapped behind the door, while survivors recalled the crush becoming so intense that they could neither move nor breathe. The evidence painted a painfully consistent picture. Attention quickly focused on the doorway itself. The heavy wooden door had been held partly closed by a 1/2-inch iron bolt, leaving an opening of just 22 inches, enough for only a single child to pass through at any one time. Such was the force of the crush that even the iron bolt had been bent. The inquiry also heard from the architect responsible for Victoria Hall. He insisted that the staircase had been built narrower than his original design, and that the doorway had never been intended to operate with such a restricted opening. Over time, restricting the doorway had become an accepted way of controlling the flow of people. But one question proved impossible to answer. Who had fastened the bolt that afternoon? The surviving children gave remarkably similar accounts of what happened next. Georgina's account was not the only one. 2 boys testified that they had seen a man stationed beside the exit with a box of prizes. They believed he had partly closed the door so that children would pass through one at a time while the prizes were handed out. Some witnesses believed a member of staff had partly closed the door so tickets could be checked one by one. Mr. Heseltine, Alexander Fay's assistant, acknowledged that he had been the man responsible for distributing the prizes to the children as they left the gallery. He told the court that he had taken a box of prizes to the landing at the foot of the stairs, and was there as the children began to emerge. Several children later recalled seeing a man with a box of prizes standing by the doorway, making it likely they were describing Heseltine. Mr. Heseltine described what happened from his perspective. After sending away a few children who had not paid, he went up the stairs to distribute the prizes. As the children filed down the stairs, everything seemed orderly at first. But when he reached the dress circle landing, the flow suddenly stopped, and he shouted out, "Pass along there!" Someone called out, "We can't." So pushing his way back through the crowd, Heseltine reached the doorway and found it only half open. He tried to force his way through as another surge of children came crashing towards him from behind the door. He shouted, "Stand back," before stepping outside, then tried to direct the children away from the blocked exit and towards another way out. However, he firmly denied closing or bolting the door. Others were equally certain it had stood fully open only moments before the crush began. No one could say with certainty who had moved the bolt or exactly when it had happened. In the end, the jury concluded that the restricted doorway had caused the disaster. Although some witnesses believed the man distributing the prizes had partially closed it to slow the flow of children, no conclusive evidence identified who had actually slipped the bolt. In the end, the jury concluded that the door had been partially closed by someone, but there was insufficient evidence to determine who that person was. Like so many disasters throughout history, Victoria Hall was not the result of a single malicious act, but a series of ordinary decisions and accepted practices that on one terrible afternoon combined with devastating consequences. Out of unimaginable tragedy came lasting change. One of the clearest lessons concerned the way exit doors were built. At Victoria Hall, the fatal door opened inwards. Once hundreds of children had been forced against it, there was simply no room left for it to swing open, even after the rescuers reached it. The crowd itself had become the barrier. In the years that followed, public buildings increasingly abandoned inward opening exit doors in favour of doors that opened outwards. If a frightened crowd surged towards an exit, the pressure of the people would now help force the door open instead of holding it shut. Among those profoundly affected by the disaster was a young engineering apprentice named Robert Alexander Briggs. 8 years later, he patented a simple but revolutionary mechanism for theatre and public building doors. Locked from the outside, they could nevertheless be thrown open instantly from within by pressing against a horizontal bar. Today we know it simply as the panic bar or crash bar. It has become one of the most important safety devices ever developed for public buildings, protecting millions of people every year. Every time one of those doors swings effortlessly open, it does so because the lessons of Victoria Hall were never forgotten. Richard and Margaret Mills expected to hear 4 excited children come racing back through their front door that evening, each desperate to tell the story of the magic show before the others could get a word in. Instead, they buried every one of them. Today, Victoria Hall is remembered by a beautiful memorial and by the names carved into family headstones across Sunderland. But perhaps its greatest memorial is that simple bars on every door, in every theatre, every cinema, every school and every public building, where people can leave quickly and safely in an emergency. The children who left home that Saturday afternoon expected an afternoon of magic. Instead, they changed the way the world builds its public buildings. It's a legacy they never chose, but one that continues to save lives every single day. Now, there was such a large loss of young life in this incident, and it really got me thinking, could it have been Mr. Heseltine who bolted the door? Perhaps that's just me. At any rate, I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.